Hello and welcome back. In this video, I wanted to talk about the second and the third sources of uncertainty from Bruno Latour's Reassembling the Social. And in the second source of uncertainty, he's talking about action. What do we mean by action? Uh, what should we avoid thinking about when we think about action? Um, and one of Latour's key themes, I think, throughout the book, really, or the whole actor network theory, is that we want to be careful what we assume, what we take for granted, and entertain really a healthy sense of skepticism and being willing to see things as being very, very complicated, way more complicated than we might have thought, and probably more complicated than we could ever fully understand. So it's kind of a humble way to go about this sort of social theory, but I like his attitude here. I think it's healthy. So anyway, we talk about the social here, starting off with, and he's got a couple different ways that he talks about what he means by social. And he in the next chapter he talks about a grocery store analogy that I think is really clear. But here in this chapter, he's talking about it not being stuff, but binding together. So when we think about the social, we don't want to be thinking about stuff, but I think he said before it's sort of like a performing something that's performed, something that happens. I think somebody said in their nuggets. That makes a lot more sense to put it that way, according to Latour. So when we act, who else is acting? So this is again coming back to his idea of these collectives or the assemblages, and this sort of network. Everything is kind of networked, including actions. So he starts off with a couple of things that he points out about action. How we might think we sort of act consciously, but really we're kind of deluding ourselves when we think that way. He says, really, when you act, you're kind of a node or just part of this node, not conglomerate. And many, many things have some kind of say or impact on that act. And if you really want to understand an action, you have to untangle this huge mess. And you probably never will again sort it all out, which I think is one of Latour's points, but at least you can try and you'll understand the action better if you at least make that effort than if you just delude yourself into thinking it's just some sort of simplistic notion of agency. And so he says we're never alone in carrying out a course of action. And he's got some information in there about statistics. And you might think that, well, one of the choices he gives is, I think, a young woman in love. And that seems like a pretty individual choice if there ever was one, who you want to love. But then you find out, maybe statistically speaking, it was just about everybody that fits into your demographic happens to be in love with somebody that fits this other demographic. And that's sort of weird, right? Another example I hear along these lines is with fast food places and how they can take a picture of you when you're going through the drive-through, and they have so much data collected at this point that they can make a pretty good prediction as to what food you're going to order when you go through that drive-through. And when you hear something like that, and it can sort of make you sort of reel back and think, "Wow, I thought I was making a conscious choice for that Big Mac, but really, I seem to be being controlled somehow, or there's all these other influences on me." He talks about the these trends, I suppose, these snobby attitudes you might have if you're a first generation college student looking back at your parents. And so I think what he's getting at there is that we don't want to. I don't think he would go so far as to say there's no choice or that you have no say. It's just that we have to sort of take into consideration all of these other more mysterious influencers on us. All this, basically, when we make a choice, there's a lot of other stuff involved that we may or may not be aware of. So he talks about action as being other taken, and these aliens who barge in as uninvited guests. He talks about there. Actions mysteriously carried out same time distributed to others. So he says there again, you don't want to conflate these other agencies. Just call it, well, that's social pressures, or that's just that's your culture coming through. For Latour, that's really when you say something like that, it's you're not really saying anything. It just might sound like you are, but really it's a tautology, and he'll get into that more. But again, for him, it would be go back to being an ant and look at all of these little strands going all these different directions and tying together all of these different things. So let's say there, an actor. So an actor for Latour is a moving target, a vast array of entities swarming towards it. And he gives what I think is a very helpful example of what he means by that, by using the example of an actor on a stage actor. He says it's a sort of a nice coincidence that we use the same word, actor, for that. But if you think about an actor, and maybe you've been in a play at some point, and there's kind of ambiguities around that when you really think about, well, you're up there, you're sort of moving your hand a certain way, you're saying certain lines. Is that you doing that? Are you playing a role? And it seems to be a little kind of a weird combination of the two, right? And then you think about it wouldn't be a play if it was just you in a room somewhere going through the script, right? It's just sort of big production that takes place. And the play is kind of all that collective people up there, the props, of course, the script. It's a pretty complicated production. Even a really simple play, there's so much stuff going on, right? And so I think he uses that example to sort of try to get us into this mindset of maybe this stuff isn't as clear cut as we'd like to think. He says, really, this very word actor directs our attention to the complete dislocation of the action. So again, I think if you think about an actor in terms of being on stage, that's a good place to be intellectually when you're trying to think about what Latour means by actors, that sort of haziness. And he says this again and again, we don't want to invent this hidden social drive to explain everything. So that, he said this is why he doesn't like so many other social theorists, right? They throw out this quote unquote explanation about something. Well, that was, we can explain all this by referring to the social elements. So for him, you're not really explaining anything when you say something like that. Really, you need to explain what you mean by the social. It's not an answer to the question, as many social scientists, at least according to Latour, would like to do. And one of the things he says I think is really interesting is that, when you can ask people, well, why are you doing that? Or why did you do that? Explain yourself or your motives. And he says, they'll say things back. It could be they say, well, I had bad parents. That explains why I'm wondering if he thinks he's thinking about a criminal, maybe. You're on drugs because you had bad parents, right? Or he says, I was called by the Virgin Mary. So, you could imagine people saying things like this. And he says what you don't want to do is say, well, wasn't that somebody says they were, was it the Summer of Sam, and the guy was saying his dog told him to kill. If you say, well, I did that, I killed because my dog told me to do it. So he says, what you want to resist is just saying, well, that's kind of quaint, right? This person's crazy. Clearly, this person is crazy. We need to just ignore whatever it is he or she is saying. It's not important. I'm the analyst. I'm the expert, the sociologist. I think we can put that sort of response into this category. We can catalog it this way, and really not even pay attention to what the person's actually saying. So for Latour, this is pretty much the opposite of what you should be doing. And this is a little quotation on page 50 I thought was very helpful. So he says, would you qualify as scientific a discipline that puts to one side the precise information offered by the field work and replaces it by instances of other things that are invisible, and those things people have not said or have even vocally denied. It says even if that were excellent politics, it would still be bad science. So you could imagine it is a good question. I think what Latour says. It's I can't think of any kind of scientific field where you would go out into the field and collect this data and then systematically ignore the data and just basically try to put everything into this sort of pre-existing categories that you had before you even went out into the field. When you really get down to it, that is pretty bad science. It wouldn't matter what kind of science it was. He does say it might make for excellent politics, but still bad science. So if you know a lot about science, you know how important it is, of course, to have the double-blind studies, not to have preconceptions about your data. Because once you start doing that, you're no longer in the scientific realm, right? You're just looking for the evidence that's going to support your theory instead of the other way around. So there are agencies on page 52. He's talking about agencies being innumerable. Controversies about agency, though, have a nice way of ordering themselves. So this is one of the things that he comes back to again and again about this idea that there's all kinds of stuff going on, but it's sort of that situation of, if the tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? I think that's sort of what he's getting at here about agencies. So yeah, you got all these different agencies out there. We can see some that humans have nothing to do with, but it's really only when they become part of an account, in other words, represented somehow, that's when we can start to study them. If they're, this is over on page 53, he says, if you don't have any kind of account of it, if you don't have that, then there's really nothing meaningful you can say about it. There's no invisible agencies out there that make no difference. That's just conspiracy theory, Latour says. That's not social theory. So again, if a tree falls in the woods and maybe it makes a sound, maybe it doesn't, but nobody heard it, so we can't say anything meaningful about it, right? Can't make any arguments about that. It's just unknowable, really. So at least that's how I'm interpreting what Latour there is saying about these accounts. He also talks about the figuration. They say in the account they'll have some kind of, what he says, flesh and features, so that they'll have some form or shape, no matter how vague. Then he says there's many different kinds of these. Could be ideas, or anthropomorphic, or technological, biological. And then another concept is actants from literature. And he says this ought to make you happy if you study literature. He says literary theorists are a great place to turn because they have freer notions of this figuration idea. And you've probably read stories before where you might have some humans characters, but in some sense, the non-humans in the story play a very active role in the narrative. So a house maybe, or if you watch Star Trek, one of my favorite shows, a lot of fans talk about how the ship, the Enterprise, it's not a character per se, but it's kind of a character, right? It does play a strong role in the narrative. And then, of course, you've got all kinds of stories about dogs, cats, whatever. So really, the literary theorist is sort of used to thinking about non-humans as characters or agents or actants. And really, this sort of flexibility would be useful, Latour thinks, for the social theorists as well. So it says the diversity of which is there are different ways to make actors do things. The diversity of which is fully deployed without having to sort in advance the true agencies from the false ones, and without having to assume that they are all translatable in the repetitive idiom of the social. So if you've done any literary criticism, this is one of the things you do, right? You could even look at Kenneth Burke's Pentad and where he gets a lot of his terminology from. He's this idea of these motives, and you got all kinds of motives, right? true. It's not so much about true and false, and it's not about being able to translate these things into the social terminology. We have to be, I guess, a little more free thinking on these topics. This is also funny. He talks about how the actors, if you actually sit down and talk to them about uh, their actions, they'll point out, well, you're saying that I'm doing this because of ideology, or you're saying I'm doing this because of hormones, or whatever it is, the music I'm listening to. And the actors would tell you themselves, no, I'm not influenced at all by that. I have some other explanation. And again, this is what Latour says is, isn't it weird if you just ignore what the actor tells you and you only pay attention to this sort of theory that you had going into the situation? Let's see, over on page 59, he talks about his actor network theory as picturing a world made of concatenations of mediators where each point can be said to fully act. So, if you remember from last time, you have the intermediaries, which they're sort of simple, sort of tools. You don't really have to pay attention to them. They're predictable, versus the mediators that are a lot more unpredictable. You put something in, you get something out. You never know what's going to go in or what's going to come out. He says we really need to multiply those and assume that a lot more stuff is like these mediators than are like those intermediaries. And I love his idea about the puppets. And I got another example I've heard of to illustrate this, but you could imagine being with some marionettes, and you have the strings, and you got the puppet there, and you could look at that situation, somebody controlling a puppet, and say, well, it's pretty clear to me that you got a guy there, a puppeteer, pulling these strings, and clearly that's the actor. The puppet's just an object. The puppet doesn't have any say in this, right? But then he says, if you actually talk to these puppeteers, these folks with the marionettes, they'll tell you that it really feels like this puppet has a life of its own. It's not a one-way street here. I feel like the my choice of marionette kind of affects my behavior too. Was it Jeff Dunham, I think, on Netflix with all these different puppets? I'm sure. I don't know if you'd be curious if you could find an interview with him. I bet he would probably say something just like what Latour says here, that in a way you control the puppet, sure, but it's actually more complex than that because the puppet kind of controls you as well. Man, that's just pretty interesting. Now, closer to home, though, I've heard many creative writers, poets, you name it, and they'll say things like, well, sometimes it feels like I'm just writing down, I'm just following my characters. These characters are doing their own thing. I'm here telling their stories. I'm listening to my characters. I'm putting the dialogue on the page, but really these characters are kind of controlling me as much as I'm controlling them. And you could imagine somebody saying, "Oh, you're being ridiculous. It's just you. Come on, it's just you." You sound a little crazy to me saying that. Clearly, you're the one that's writing the story. You're the one that's putting the dialogue down. But again, if you've ever actually sat down to write something like that, it's true. It's not just that one way situation there. So I think he's absolutely right. Listen, just quit being so arrogant, and just listen to what people themselves are saying about their behaviors. And this gives example of billiard balls. That's just another example of this. So I love this part on 61. It says, concreteness doesn't come from choosing some figuration over some other ones in the place of the actors, but from the increase in the accounts of the relative share of the mediators over the intermediaries. So that makes a lot of sense to me. hopefully it does for you as well. So let's see. I think that's the end of that one. He's got some questions there for us. So anyway, this would be a good spot to pause, I think. What do you think about what Latour is saying here about action? Does it jive with your experience? Do you have other examples of that, how actions can get a lot more complicated than people might think? Maybe have your own sort of puppet examples. So, yeah, just what do you think about that source of uncertainty? All right, then moving on then to the third source of uncertainty, and this is where he gets into objects, non-human objects having agency. And this is really the source where a lot of the new materialists have picked up with this. And part of a new materialism, as the name implies, is getting not necessarily replacing material for social or for human, but just taking stuff seriously. I think is one way to put it. As I opens this chapter kind of with an interesting sort of question, what have you done with power and domination? So if you know anything about critical theory from other courses, this always comes up, right? Power, domination, hegemony, ideology. These notions come up again and again. And for Latour, this is a problem because often whatever this thing power is given as an answer, or this is supposed to explain something, but it itself is not explained. It becomes kind of this tautology. So it says, don't affect, I guess what he would say, this is on page 64, don't confuse the effects for the causes. So you could think about, excuse me, power and domination as being an effect of something rather than causing something. So having to be produced, made up, and composed. So I'll jump forward here to page 85 because I just thought this was, I love he's kind of playing with this phrase. So everybody's heard this before. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I'm not sure where that comes from, if it's a comic book or what, but we've all heard that. But he twists it a little bit or tweaks it. He says, well, if absolute power corrupts absolutely, then gratuitous use of power by so many critical theorists has corrupted them absolutely, or at least rendered their discipline redundant and their politics impotent. So I'll come back to this with a question at the end of this source of uncertainty, but just as we're going through this rest of this chapter, I want you to be thinking about what he means by this quotation on page 85. So here we go with this grocery store analogy I like so much. So I can see that he was concerned that people wouldn't quite get what he meant by social because, again, it's been sort of drilled into us. So I guess even from high school, if not before that, this idea of the social world, social forces, social studies, right? And so he keeps coming back to this idea that it's not an item, it's not a domain of reality, it's some kind of movement, a spark, a displacement. What he really likes is to call it an association between entities which are in no way recognizable as being social, except when they're reshuffled together. And then he has this I love this analogy of the supermarket. So I'll just put it in my own words. So you don't want to think about all of these different things, all these different aisles in the supermarket. And look, this aisle here, this is the social aisle. And here we find all of the social forces. It doesn't work like that. Rather, what the social is not an aisle, but it's the way that on any given day, all these different shelves are arranged with new products, new combinations, new paths through the supermarket. You could even think about how if you go to a store and you're like, where is the the detergent, right? Why is the dishwashing detergent not over here by the dryer sheets or whatever? Why did they decide to put it over in this other section? And I don't know about you. I had this experience every time I go to the store. You're like, how did these goods get organized in this way? What is the relationships at work here? What is the logic of this? And I think for Latour, he would say, well, that's sort of what we mean by the social. That's kind of how the social works, right? These sort of combinations, these associations, it's always changing. There's no real, maybe there's no real logic to it at all. But sometimes you go in there and things are changed around. And at those moments, it sort of becomes visible to you. Hey, these things could have been arranged in all these other ways, but they're arranged this way. You sort of become conscious of that of shift, I suppose. And yeah, I guess another way to think about this too, if you go to a grocery store all the time and you've been there enough times, you know your way through it, you know where the stuff is that you want, and you don't really even thinking about it, right? You just sort of go there. You're not even conscious of, you may, did I go to the grocery store? Wow. I was in a haze the whole time, right? So you could imagine that versus you go in there and suddenly everything's been remodeled and suddenly you don't know where the, the stuff is. And maybe they don't even have the stuff anymore that you usually buy from that store. So suddenly you're really conscious of it all. And I think for Latour, those are the moments, right? When all the stuff that was not necessarily invisible, but just you weren't thinking about it. It wasn't visible to you, didn't enter into any kind of mental space. Suddenly it is there, though. That's when you become aware of it. And that's when you can study this stuff and, have something to say about it. So I don't know what it is about that, but I just love that. I just love thinking about these. Next time you go to a grocery store or any store, think about it, right? How do these all this stuff get organized in this way, and what does that reveal? And then something else that's great about this chapter too is when he starts talking about the social or the basic social skills, and he talks about baboons at one point. But if you think about these baboons, that's over on page 69. He's got this little aside, and I don't know, maybe they use objects. I'm not sure, but if we just sort of play with this example a little bit. So you can imagine this society of baboons or this group of baboons out there, and they've got some kind of social world, right? But they don't use objects or things. They're not wearing uniforms or jewelry, let's say. Everything is physical, right? I guess they're picking gnats off of each other or making body using body language extensively. I don't know. So what Latour says is that a lot of what sociologists talk about, it makes sense if you are talking about these baboons with their lack of objects. But if you look at anything human, you realize that just about everything is entangled with objects. So things are everywhere, and we have very complex relationships to all of these things around us. And so again, it comes back to this idea of the social often being a tautology. So we might say, well, what really holds these people together? Well, it's the social forces that hold them together. What do you mean by the social forces? Well, I mean everything that's not a thing, but are these human social interactions. And really, when you get down to it, if I'm understanding this right, is you're talking about any kind of interaction that doesn't involve a thing that's in this other kind of stuff besides some kind of material exchange. And for Latour, he calls this a tautology because you're saying, well, what makes this durable? What makes this endure? And the only thing you can say, well, it's the social. I just told you it was the social. So you're kind of using that as the answer to the question. He says it's just begging the question because you really haven't explained how that happens. And for Latour, it seems like the only way you can get at that how is when you bring in the things, right? The objects. He says the entities that don't sleep and associations that don't break down, that allow power to last longer, expand further. And again, he says that even with those baboons, and they had to do a lot of work to maintain that world of theirs. Whereas for humans, even you want to talk about quote unquote primitive societies, whatever, they have a lot of things, and it's very sophisticated relationships they have to all of these things. So he says, don't exclude them then from your notions of collective existence. We want to accept them as full blown actors, and we don't want to just limit things to intentional things that humans do, meaningful things to humans, but anything that modifies the state of affairs by making a difference. So this is where you could get a little carried away, I think, with this idea. But so what's an actor? Well, it's just anything that modifies the state of affairs by making a difference. So again, coming back to the idea of the literary theorist and like a story, you could have something acting in that story that's not a human at all, not even alive. It could be an inanimate object, but it has a big impact on the state of affairs in that story, right? So for Latour, he just says, let's just take that same concept, and instead of just limiting it to stories, let's just think about everything that way. So zapping a television with or without a remote control is a pretty fun example of that. So you could sit there doing this all day long. It's not going to really have it's not going to modify the state of affairs of what's on that television unless you have the remote control there. But then he's careful to say that, okay, let's not go to the other extreme and say that the objects determine the action. That's technological determinism. So if you say things like, don't blame me, my iPhone made me do it. Why didn't you pay attention to the lecture? Well, it's not my fault. It's this iPhone is controlling me. And so that's just as silly as the opposite, making out like the iPhone doesn't have any kind of control over you, or doesn't have any kind of impact. Is it? Look, it's many metaphysical shades between those, either one of those extremes, the full causality or the sheer inexistence. So if I were saying that, well, this, my decision to look over here at this phone had nothing whatsoever to do with the phone, it was a purely individual mental event. That's just as silly as saying that I had, whoa, it's got some kind of psychic control over my body. Either way, it's silly. And he gives a lot of different ways that things can influence. They can authorize you to do things. He talks about block, or what was the example he used? I don't know. I'm thinking about railings. You driving your car, and you see that railing on the side. You could say to some extent that sort of influences where you can go, or blocks your path. So he says things explain the overarching powers of society, the huge asymmetries, the crushing exercise of power, etc. And he doesn't seem to really go here in this chapter anyway. Maybe he'll get some more examples of this. But I was thinking something that always kind of stuck with me. I don't know why I was watching this. I guess a social worker. I forget the context of this completely. I just remember he made a little statement that really there's no such thing as less fortunate people. There's just less fortune. So it's not less fortunate people, just people with less fortune. And I always thought that was an intriguing idea, that the stuff, the fortune, without that. Or I guess what I'm wondering is, can you have without things, whether that be money, gold, food, all this material stuff, could you have power without that, or vice versa? I think that's sort of the area that we want to be in mentally, thinking about these questions. So coming away from the idea of power just being strictly a social thing, likewise also avoiding it, thinking about it completely as a material reality, but somewhere in between. So collectives being an action that collects different types of forces woven together because they are different. Then he gives an example there's of social inertia and physical gravity might seem unconnected, but not when you're talking about a team of workers building a wall of bricks. And he gives another example too about these, I guess this army, all these soldiers show up and they're all the weapons and equipment, ammunition's in a big pile there. Acting like those, like you got two totally separate things going on there. When of course we know that these things are inextricably bound together. It says actions are rarely exclusively human to human or object to object, but rather just zigzagging all over the place. So let's see, where are we? That's up to page 79. So to be accounted for, objects have to enter into accounts. We said this before in the other section. If there's no trace of it, there's no info to the observer, no visible effect, and they're not actors, or at least they're unaccountable. But he does say it's not that they stop acting. It's just there's no longer a visible connection. And once you've got something that's invisible, that you don't know anything about, you really can't say anything about it. And if you do, you're just, again, being delusional, or you're indulging a conspiracy theory. It is just not scientific. Whatever that is, it's not good science, right? And he also makes the point that how objects can quickly shift from these intermediaries, these simple black box type situations, into these mediators. And he's got lots of great examples here about, again, I think about the iPhone, and you probably don't think a lot about, I'm using an iPhone, and look, I'm pressing this button. You don't think that way when you're using the device. It's largely invisible almost, or unconscious. But if it breaks, it won't come on. Suddenly you really start to pay attention to this device, right? So he says those are sort of the controversies, if you will, where that becomes visible, or when there's something, there's some big innovation. So a lot of people get really bothered. All these kids. I just saw an article this morning. We really need to do, I think it was, we need to have a conversation about kids and cell phones, or kids and smartphones. I think that was the subject, the headline. So the smartphones are still, I guess, an innovation. There's still a lot of controversy about these things, so we're kind of really aware of them. He says that's great, because that's when you can really see these connections. You can do meaningful social work, I guess, social studies, when that sort of stuff is going on. On the other hand, if they were so ubiquitous and we were so just used to them that nobody ever paid any attention to them, we never thought about it, then it would go back into this other category, right? Of for all intents and purposes, it might as well be invisible. It's an intermediary rather than the mediator. But then he says that they can suddenly jump over and become the other thing, right? And he gives lots of examples. You could have a breakdown. We talked about that. Or you could even have these ancient objects. So you see that all the time in archaeology, right? You just got this weird, I just saw one today about skulls in these, I guess archaeologists find these ancient dwellings, and they find these decorated skulls everywhere. Of course, real human skulls all over these dwellings. And of course, we don't do that today. You probably don't have a human skull in your apartment or house or whatever. And so the distance there can sometimes pop these things back into mediators, because we're like, oh, what the heck is going on with that? Right. So I thought that was great. And then he criticizes the sociologists again. He talks about how they limited themselves really to the social stuff. They want to talk about language, symbols, the discursive turn. You might have heard that term before. And leave the sort of lion's share of the rest of it to the scientists and the engineers. So he was talking about how if you're riding your bike, you see a stop sign, you could talk about that as the stop sign is sort of symbolic. It's got sort of a language, a visual, communication, whatever you want to call it. Okay, that's social. But the actual material that the sign is made out of, or the mechanics of that brake, When pull the brake to stop the bike, that's getting out of the social world. That's something for engineers to talk about, uh, not the not the sociologist. So for Latour, he says, you don't want to do that though. It was a mistake, and it had some consequences. Okay, so at this point, I'll go back again to this quotation here on page 85. So with all this in mind, so let's go back to page 85 with all this in mind. If absolute power corrupts absolutely, the gratuitous use of power by so many critical theorists has corrupted them absolutely, or at least rendered their discipline redundant and their politics impotent. So maybe this question might make more sense to you at this point of this quotation. So again, thinking about how a sociologist or critical theorist, let's say, would want to bracket out everything other than what has to do with symbolism or language, and ignore any kind of non-human actors or objects or material realities, and just pay attention to the quote-unquote social realities. So with that in mind, right, if you did that, how does that render your discipline redundant and your politics impotent? I think that'd be a great spot to stop on there. Anyway, hopefully this was helpful. If you do have questions, happy to explore them with you. But anyway, I'll stop it here and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.